Imagine you have money, and you decide to go shopping for things that are not for sale. Not a bigger house, not a nicer horse. Things that money is specifically not supposed to be able to buy. Over about 300 years, one family in one Italian city bought all of these. 1. A legal way to charge interest, in a place where charging interest was a sin. 2. The bank account of the Catholic Church. 3. An entire city, without ever holding office in it. 4. The Pope, twice. And 5. Forever. The family was called the Medici. 4 of those 5 purchases eventually fell apart, and one of them helped split European Christianity in half. The 5th one worked. It is the only thing they have left, and about 4 million people a year queue up to look at it. Start in Florence, around the year 1400. Here is the problem every banker in Christian Europe had. The church taught that charging interest on a loan was the sin of usury, not frowned upon. A sin with consequences that a medieval person took extremely seriously, which is awkward because an economy without lending does not really work. You cannot fund a voyage, or a wool shipment, or a wool shipment, or a wool shipment without somebody advancing money and expecting more back. So how do you run a bank when the central product of banking is forbidden? The Medici answer was beautiful, and it was not really a trick. It was a redefinition. They did not lend you money. They exchanged currency with you. Here is how it worked. A merchant in Florence needs funds. The Medici give him florins today, in exchange for a promise that his agent in London will pay them back in pounds in 3 months. That is not a loan. That is a currency exchange, with a delivery date, which is a completely legitimate trade. And the exchange rate they set was, entirely coincidentally, favorable to the Medici, by roughly what the interest would have been. That instrument was called a bill of exchange. It was legal, it was accepted, and it made the family rich. Item 1. Bought. Now, if you have just built a very good method for moving money between cities, who is your ideal customer? Somebody with money coming in from absolutely everywhere, who needs all of it moved to one place. There was exactly one organization like that in Europe. The church collected revenue from every corner of the continent, in a dozen different currencies, and needed it in Rome. Physically carting coins across Europe meant bandits, mountains, and months. The Medici had branches in the major cities, and a paper instrument that moved money without moving money. So they became the papal bank. The branch handling church business in Rome became by a distance the most profitable thing the family owned. And notice the shape of what just happened, because it is the whole story in miniature. The institution that had banned charging interest became the biggest customer of the man who had found the way round it. Nobody was being a hypocrite exactly. The instrument was genuinely legal, but everybody involved knew precisely what it was. Cosimo de' Medici inherited the bank in the 1420s and did something with it that nobody had quite done before. He bought a city, and he never once held the office that ran it. Florence at the time was proudly a republic. It had elections, councils, and a genuine horror of anybody making themselves a prince. So Cosimo did not become one. He lent money to the men who did hold the offices. He funded the guilds. He paid for public buildings. He made himself the person whose approval you needed, and stayed carefully out of the chair. His enemies understood exactly what was happening. In 1433, they had him exiled. It lasted less than a year, because it turned out that the city's finances did not work without him. And within 12 months, Florence asked him to come back. He returned and effectively ran Florence until he died, and the family ran it after him. Item 3. Bought. Not with a coup, with a loan book. Now the big one, and it is the purchase that eventually came with a bill nobody expected. Two members of the family became pope, one in the early 1500s and a cousin about a decade later. Getting a family member elected pope is not a straightforward transaction, and I am not going to pretend it was a simple purchase. It took generations of position, alliance, patronage, and the kind of influence that only enormous money buys. But nobody at the time was under any illusion about how the family got there. And here is where the story stops being fun. The first Medici pope had expensive ambitions. Rome was being rebuilt. St. Peter's Basilica, the enormous church you can picture right now, needed paying for. So the church leaned hard on a fundraising method it already had. An indulgence was a document connected to the remission of punishment for sin. Whatever the theology of it, in practice, by that period, in many places, it had become something people paid money for. The campaign to fund the basilica pushed that practice hard and publicly. And in 1517, a German monk who had watched it happen wrote out a list of objections and made them public. That list became the beginning of the Reformation, which split Western Christianity permanently and reshaped European politics for the next 2 centuries. I want to be careful here. The Reformation had many causes and had been building for a long time, and no serious historian says one family's building project caused it. But the fundraising that lit the fuse was happening under a Medici pope to pay for a Medici-era Rome. That is the most expensive thing anybody in this story ever bought, and the price was not paid in money. While all of that was happening, the thing that paid for everything was quietly failing. The later generations were superb patrons, superb politicians, and increasingly poor bankers. The most famous of them, the one whose name everybody knows, was a genuinely great patron of artists and a genuinely bad manager of a bank. Branches were run by managers he did not supervise closely. Loans were made to rulers for political reasons rather than commercial ones. And rulers are notoriously difficult to send debt collectors after. There is a pattern here you have seen in this channel before. The first generation built the thing. The later generations inherited a position that no longer required them to be good at the thing. And the thing quietly stopped working, while everybody was busy being magnificent. In 1494, the family was thrown out of Florence, and the bank collapsed with them. They came back later, and eventually ruled Tuscany as dukes for 200 years. But the machine that had made all of it possible was gone before the 15th century was. So let me put it to you here, because I genuinely do not know the answer. They spent the family fortune buying influence, and the fortune ran out. Was that a failure, or was influence what they were trying to buy all along? Tell me in the comments. Now the other side right. I have described 3 centuries of a family buying things that were not for sale. Let me make the other case, because it is overwhelming and it is not close. 1. They funded the Renaissance, and that is not an exaggeration. The family paid for the dome on Florence Cathedral, which nobody at the time knew how to build, and which is still the largest masonry dome in the world. They funded sculptors, painters, and architects across generations. One of the most famous artists in history was effectively raised in their household as a teenager. They collected and preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts at a moment when those texts were still being lost. Later generations of the family funded a scientist who pointed a telescope at Jupiter, found 4 moons, and named them after his patrons. 2. Patronage was not a hobby. It was the delivery mechanism. There was no public arts funding and no research grant system. If a wealthy family did not pay for it, it did not exist. You can dislike how they got the money and still notice what happened when they spent it. 3. And the fair version of the criticism is narrower than it sounds. They did not invent lending money at interest, or influence in politics, or wealthy families getting relatives into high office. Every one of those existed before them and after them. What the Medici did was do all of it unusually well, write it down carefully, and then spend an extraordinary proportion of the proceeds on things that are still standing. Which brings us to the last item on the list, and to the person who is the actual hero of this story. By the 1730s, the Medici line was ending. The last ruler of the family died without an heir. The dukedom was going to pass to a foreign family, and by long custom, a family's private possessions leave with the family, which meant that everything the Medici had collected over 300 years, the paintings, the sculpture, the books, the antiquities, was about to be packed up and carried out of Florence. The last of the line was a woman, the sister of that final ruler. And in 1737, she signed an agreement with the incoming rulers of Tuscany. She gave them everything, the entire collection, on one condition: that none of it may ever leave Florence. Not that it be preserved, not that it be displayed nicely, that it stay permanently for the benefit of the public and of anyone who came to see it. That agreement is the reason the collection is still intact and still in that city today, rather than distributed around the palaces and museums of Europe. The bank is gone. The dukedom is gone. The family is gone entirely, ended with her. And the queue to get into the gallery that holds what she saved runs down the street. Most days, most of the year, she is the only one in 300 years who bought something and made it non-returnable. What it actually tells you: 3 things. 1. Rules that everyone works around are worse than no rules. Banning interest did not stop lending. It made lending complicated, opaque, and available mainly to people sophisticated enough to structure a bill of exchange. The rule did not protect the poor from debt. It priced them out of credit and handed a license to whoever had the best lawyers. That is not a medieval problem. That happens now. 2. Influence is not a store of value. You can convert money into influence. It works. But influence does not sit still. It does not compound. And it evaporates entirely when the money behind it stops. The Medici bought a city, an institution, and a throne, and all 3 eventually left. 3. The only thing anybody in this story managed to keep was the thing they gave away with conditions attached. The everything the family held on to was lost. The one thing that survived is the one thing a woman signed over to the public, with a clause saying it could never be moved. There is a version of this story where the lesson is that money can buy anything. I think it is the opposite. 300 years of buying things that were not for sale, and the only purchase that held was the one where somebody wrote down that it could never be sold again. Outro next. The chocolate family, who built a town for their workers, banned pubs in it, and accidentally invented the modern office. Subscribe. I will keep drawing them small.